Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. What if Naruto joined the mystery gang and found love abroad with Daphne? Movie. Working with the mystery gang was probably the last thing Naruto had ever imagined he'd be doing after moving over to the States. He'd of course seen them before on TV, and even watched a couple of interviews since he found it rather interesting and unordinary, but in a good way. After having moved from Japan, due to his parents' work situation changing, he'd at first just worked at the same company. Though it became very clear to him in a matter of days that an office job wasn't it at all. He couldn't sit still for that long. Even if the pay was more than decent, he just couldn't find it to be worth it. You could after all only stamp signatures on so many papers before losing your mind, and in the end, it also became the reason he quit the place. Afterward, his parents had been a bit disappointed in him after having sugar-coated his situation a bit so he could get the job in the first place, but they'd forgiven him soon enough. They knew that he was rather energetic. He'd been that way ever since he'd been a child, and it had only gotten worse once he reached his teens. He'd calmed down slightly upon becoming an adult, but he could barely sit still and do the same thing for more than a couple of hours unless he was playing a game or watching a show. The difference there being there was always something new happening on the screen, so it often didn't feel like he was just sitting there and repeating the same things over and over again. Since he had bills to pay and didn't want to live off of his parents' salary, he'd as a joke sent in an application to the mystery gang, since they'd expressed on an interview that having an extra hand could be beneficial. Before he started working there, they were an uneven number. So splitting up often proved difficult, since leaving one person on their own could potentially be dangerous. So they'd always been forced to work in 2 groups, instead of splitting up into 3 groups to cover more space. Much to his surprise, he got a reply back in a week and was invited to have a chat with them. They'd hit it off almost immediately, and he'd practically been unable to remove the smile from his face on his way home after Fred had shaken his hand and welcomed him into the group. That had been around 4 months ago now, and he was currently waiting for them to pick him up for yet another job. He had had plenty of fun so far, even if Scooby and Shaggy's cowardly natures could be a bit of a hindrance in their line of work, he'd managed to let it amuse him more than irritate him. After all, they were so easy to spook, so pulling a few pranks here and there was almost too easy. Though much to his surprise, the person he'd hit it off with the most was Velma. Sure, the rest were nice and fun to be around as well, but she seemed very chill and down to earth. Plus she was extremely smart, way more than him, that was for sure. Her general knowledge of scientific things, and how it helped them in their jobs, was almost more of a mystery than the job itself, but he didn't complain. It made their lives way easier, and he got to learn a thing or two here and there. Plus, he'd be a liar if he said he didn't find her rather cute and attractive during those moments, and at other times for that matter. It had gotten to a point where even Fred and Shaggy would give him the occasional glance that'd tell him that they knew what he was thinking, but they hadn't voiced it out loud yet. The thought made him chuckle a bit as he watched the van pull up to the sidewalk. Immediately he tried to clear his thoughts about the matter as he reached over to open the side door and step inside. "Morning, y'all sleep well?" he greeted as he took a seat, conveniently enough beside the glasses-wearing young woman, and clicked in his seatbelt. "Can't complain." Daphne greeted him with a slight shrug of her shoulders as she gave him an acknowledging look as he stood a seat. Fred chuckled a bit from the front. "I slept all right, though we had to wake up Shaggy and Scoob." Naruto's sweat dropped. They overslept again. A slight groan escaped the brown-haired man behind them. "Come on, it isn't our fault that the best shows always come on late at night." The blonde raised a suspicious brow at that. What about you, Velma?" Seemingly having been too caught in her own thoughts, she didn't respond until she saw the blonde wave a hand in front of her eyes. Her cheeks turning a slight pink as she smiled sheepishly. "Oh yeah, just fine. Had a lot of work to do, but I managed to make it all go around." The rest of the drive toward their destination was done in almost silence. Shaggy and Scoob in the back were promptly asleep already, if the loud snoring was any indication. Fred and Daphne seemed to go through some small talk at the front, leaving just the two in the middle to their own thing. While Naruto was definitely the more humorous of the pair, it didn't really matter much. Every time he found a funny video on his phone as he just surfed around the internet, he nudged her slightly in the side so she could see. Having found out they had a pretty similar humor helped to the point that it seemed like they almost had their own party while the rest pretty much just minded their own business and left them to it. Though when the van stopped in front of a 3-story tall mansion, he felt a little more awake than usual. Shaggy woke up first. The moment their van stopped, he opened the door and quickly stepped out. Naruto followed after him, and then proceeded to help Scooby get out of the van, who himself gave him a short nod before heading out to check the rear doors. Well, this is it, Fred announced with a light sigh as he pulled out his phone and started checking the time. Daphne nodded slowly. So what's the gig? Readjusting her glasses, Velma stepped up to their pair. The owner of the mansion has reported a lot of suspicious activity. Pictures and furniture moving despite no one being around, the lights flickering, and the sound of voices in the hallway. He even claimed to have seen an actual ghost that was the cause of it all. Ghost? Shaggy stammered a bit, as he shared a quick look with Scoob. Naruto rolled his eyes. Don't be a chicken. Chicken? Scoob perked up, all prior fears seemingly replaced with hunger. Daphne raised a quick brow before returning to the conversation. So, we're to figure out if it's true or not. And figure out the mystery of this supposed ghost, Fred confirmed with a quick nod of his head. Sounds easy enough. Daphne mused. We can do this. You guys ready? Fred asked, looking at the rest of them. Scoob nodded his head vigorously. Yeah. Shaggy did a tiny nod. Yep. Naruto shrugged. Why not? Fred flashed them a smile. All right then. Let's get going. With that he walked up to the front door and pressed the intercom button, prompting the door to slide open. The group filed in and took a look around. Is there anyone here? Fred called into the house, receiving no response. How about you, Daphne? Can you hear anything? No sounds, either way. Though I guess that means it doesn't have to be a ghost, she added with a shrug. This is probably just a prank, then. Naruto muttered to himself quietly. At that moment a voice sounded from the other room. It was a middle-aged man. Hey, this ain't no damn prank. Hi. Naruto spoke up nervously. Sorry for bothering you, sir. My name is Naruto Uzumaki, and I am with the Mystery Incorporated organization. We are investigating a mysterious activity in your home. Ah, yes. You must be the famous Scooby-Doo and Shaggy. The man exclaimed with a grin. Didn't expect to see you here. Naruto raised a brow. You called for us though. I figured they would only know about this kind of stuff, and that it wouldn't hurt to ask. He explained happily. Well, Mr. Cooper, we'll try and get to the bottom of this as soon as possible. Fred assured him. Thank you very much. Naruto blinked confused before he leaned down to whisper to Velma, that guy is odd. She giggled a bit behind her hand. You don't say. Maybe he is just seeing things. Still, we gotta take a look around. Scooby turned his head to glance over at them. What's up? Nothing. Naruto murmured. Let's look around. He led them around the room, examining each and every corner thoroughly. There were several places where the ceiling had water damage, making the whole place seem a bit damp, but otherwise, everything was in good condition. And nothing seemed out of the ordinary, like ghosts. Are you sure this isn't a prank? Shaggy asked quietly. Naruto shook his head. According to old Mr. Cooper, it's legit. He shrugged. Then why aren't we hearing any noises? Scooby asked, tilting his head to the side curiously, or seeing anything. I dunno. Naruto answered softly, but maybe something is hiding in the shadows. Velma sighed. If someone is playing a prank on you, it'd make more sense to hide in the shadows and jump out at you than to try and scare you by saying you saw one. True. Scoob agreed. Naruto glanced over at the group. Well, I say we keep looking for now. I think that's a great idea. Fred agreed with a smile. We can always leave if it looks like it might be dangerous. Shaggy nodded. We could. Well, let's check upstairs first, Velma suggested. Everyone nodded, except for Naruto, who stayed close to her side. They made their way to the staircase and climbed up quickly, only stopping once they reached the third floor. Doesn't feel too different from downstairs, Scooby commented after taking a moment to take it all in. The group slowly made their way through the hallway, a few times running into walls, but mostly staying in the middle of the hallways so that they could go forward without bumping into anything. As they walked, they listened carefully and tried to detect any unusual sounds, or feeling of being watched. Nothing came up. They continued along the hallway until they reached a set of double doors that were slightly ajar. The group approached it cautiously, but upon closer inspection, they noticed that the door wasn't actually open, rather there was a crack between the two. What's that sound? Shaggy asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. I don't know. Velma replied, "It's faint, but I can definitely tell it's coming from the other side." "Maybe we should take a peek inside?" Scooby suggested. "Sounds good to me," Fred added. Naruto stepped back, giving them space to open the door, which they did with ease. Once they got it open enough, they peeked inside and saw a small room with a bed, a dresser, and a closet. "There's no one here." Shaggy breathed out a sigh of relief after taking a quick look around the room. "Guess we're not dealing with a ghost in here." "Good to know," Velma told him with a nod, "but what could that noise be?" "I don't know," Scooby admitted. "My theory is it has to do with the person who lives in this house." Naruto suggested. "He was really odd. Man was acting surprised that we showed up, when he was the one who called us." Fred scratched the back of his head before clapping his hands to get the group's attention. "Well, regardless of whether or not he is odd, we still got a job to do. This is a pretty big mansion, so we should probably split up to figure out what the mystery going on here is. Daphne and I can take a look at the different floors, Shaggy and Scoob should take a look outside. You guys can try and find out if there is some kind of scent that might lead us to a clue." Naruto sighed softly as he turned to look at Velma, who was standing beside him. "I guess that leaves us with the basement. How romantic." "Hey," she smiled, "at least it's not the attic." The group exchanged glances before nodding and heading off to their separate areas. Though what Naruto didn't miss was the knowing look on Fred's face as he gave him a quick thumbs up before they departed. There was no way he hadn't planned this out beforehand. Guy Xing as Naruto and Velma got to the basement, the blonde flicked on the light. "Here goes," he whispered, "ain't scared of the dark, am I?" She laughed nervously. "No, I'm not either. But what if it's scary down here?" "I got you," he assured her, "don't worry about it." She chuckled with a soft nod of her head, "I'm sure you do." The basement was a long rectangular room lined with several doors, a small table, chairs, and a couch. Surprisingly enough, there was not a speck of dust anywhere. As if all of this had been moved down here recently, it seemed like a place someone could have been living for quite a while. It certainly wasn't what they associated with a regular basement, given that normal people just dumped stuff down there for storage. Generally things they likely never saw again unless they had to move. "Is there something you want to check first?" Velma asked, "before we start searching for clues." "Yeah," Naruto told her. "Let's see if that door leads somewhere." He pointed to the door that was closest to the entrance to the basement and made sure nothing was blocking it before opening it. It led to another short hallway which ended in another door. Naruto opened the door and looked inside. There was a large room with several couches, tables, and chairs. All of these furniture pieces were made out of wood, and all of them were in mint condition. There was also an old-looking television screen hanging on the far wall. "Wow!" Velma exclaimed. "I wonder how many years old that TV is." "Probably older than some of us." He chuckled, "but I wouldn't be surprised to hear that they still work." "That would be amazing," she said with a smile. "I don't think I've ever seen one of those before." "Me neither." Naruto agreed. "You know, I bet if we took a picture of each piece of furniture in here, we could make our own museum." Velma giggled. "That does sound like fun." Naruto nodded. "So let's try and find something interesting to photograph and then start searching for clues." "Sounds good to me." She grinned. They spent the next few minutes exploring the room and snapping pictures of everything they found. They even tried sitting on the couches, but unfortunately, none of them were comfortable. Once their search was done, Velma headed over to the door leading out of the room and Naruto followed closely behind her. The girl groaned a bit. "Air is so dry down here my lips get chapped. I should have brought my purse or something. Some lip gloss or lip balm would do wonders." Raising a brow at the complaint, Naruto chuckled. "Why? Does it hurt when you walk?" The comment immediately earned him a hard elbow to the side, which just caused him to laugh out loud. Though, despite her action, a slight smile was on her face as she shook her head and continued to walk back to the main room in the basement. "Still, could use something to lubricate my lips," she commented. Naruto immediately stared down at her, where the girl just shot him a quick wink. It baffled him for a minute. It wasn't often that someone was able to match him in that playing field, so he was pleasantly surprised that she was more than up for it. After walking through the room, they both went back to the door leading out of the basement and peeked into the other hallway. "What do you think?" Velma asked Naruto once they were close to each other. "I don't see anything," he told her honestly. "Maybe we should go upstairs and see if we can find any clues." "Okay," she agreed. "Lead the way." Naruto gave a quick nod of his head as they walked toward the door that'd lead toward the stairs, though as they walked, the lights soon began flickering around, causing them to get startled. Bumping into an old statue, a sound click was heard from the door, as if he'd touched something he shouldn't have. "Oh, you got to be kidding me." Naruto groaned as he reached for the doorknob, and found it to be locked. Who would install a hidden switch to lock their basement? Velma shrugged a bit as she rubbed the bridge of her nose, probably to prevent someone breaking in and stealing all of this stuff. It looks antique, so it might be worth a lot. Naruto rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Good point. We should try and see if we can find some kind of mechanism to unlock the door, like, there has to be one, right? Unless the owner of the mansion wanted to be able to accidentally lock himself in here like we just did. I'd assume so. Maybe in the other rooms, Velma mused as she turned around and prepared to check any possible clue, though as she spun around on her feet, she slipped on the edge of the carpet. A quick yelp escaped her pink lips as she stumbled forward and managed to regain her footing, though, despite her success in not falling to the ground, her glasses weren't as lucky. With a few quick clink wounds, the glasses skipped across the ground as the auburn-haired woman cursed beneath her breath. "Jinkies, I dropped my glasses. Do you need a hand?" Naruto offered with concern. Velma shook her head as she dropped to her knees and placed her hands on the floor, using them to search around for her glasses. "No, I'm okay. It isn't the first time, and I can't rely on others to find them for me. Imagine I drop them when I'm alone, what would I do then?" She spoke out as she began crawling around the floor. Naruto just nodded his head slowly, though his eyes were beginning to wander. "Good point," he half-heartedly mumbled through his lips, his eyes too fixated on her crawling around. He couldn't help it, she was wearing a skirt and she was crawling around on the floor. The angles he could see showed so much of her thick thighs, and occasionally he'd even be able to catch a glimpse of the curve of her ass. It would be a lie to say he hadn't done this before, and how could he not? At one point or another, most men had desired to have a woman crawl around in front of them while they watched. His mind was racing, wondering exactly what her legs looked like as she squirmed around on the floor, and if they were as smooth as he imagined. As his gaze shifted to the side, Naruto felt a sudden jolt of electricity travel from his thigh down to the rest of his body. His erection was poking up against the front of his pants, making it painfully obvious that he wasn't the only one who was distracted. Velma kept crawling around looking for her glasses, though as she moved her hands around, she placed her hands onto something both warm and hard. Curious about what it was, she wrapped her fingers around it with a slight squeeze, though immediately froze in her actions upon hearing the blonde man let out a soft groan. "Ah!" Naruto's voice suddenly echoed around the room as he stared at the place Velma had touched. "I think you're a bit off." "Eh?" Velma tried to sound nonchalant but failed as her cheeks flushed and she moved her hand away quickly. Her heart beating faster in her chest upon realizing that she'd accidentally just latched onto her coworker's crotch, and even squeezed it. Sure, she'd always found him to be quite attractive and a joy to be around, but this was hardly the time to fool around. They hadn't even gone on anything like a date yet, but she'd probably say yes if he asked. It wasn't long until Velma finally stopped moving, and she sat up to look where she had been crawling around, only to let out a soft sigh. Her fingers brushed against her skirt as she turned and looked back at Naruto. "I guess I lost them. How do I look without these?" she questioned in a low voice. Naruto couldn't help but glance down at her, noticing that her skirt was hanging a little lower than usual. "You look great," he assured her with a soft smile, and knelt down beside her. "But if you're willing, I can help you find your glasses?" Velma blushed as she glanced up at him. "Thank you, I suppose." She nodded her head softly. The two of them stayed quiet as they searched the room together. After a few seconds of looking around, Naruto noticed the rim of her glasses sticking out from beneath the antique couch. "Seems like I got the jackpot. They're over here," he informed her with a grin. Velma giggled lightly as she crawled toward him, following the sound of her voice as she sat directly in front of him. The blonde gave her a slight grin as he lifted her glasses and gently placed them onto her face. "There you go, all better, right?" As her vision cleared, she stared directly up at him. A soft nod of her head as she remained silent, yet, her head lowered slightly as she trailed her gaze down his body. She hadn't forgotten what happened just a few minutes prior, and her heart almost threatened to launch out of her chest upon the sight of the rather large bulge formed in his pants, and she knew she was the cause, and if she had to be honest, it made her feel quite happy and also flattered. Naruto didn't seem to notice as he gave her a gentle smile. "Well, shall we get going? If we don't leave soon, He'll start to wonder why we're still here. He spoke out, and gestured for her to follow him out of the room. Come on. Let's head back to the main room. He added as he stood up to his feet. Velma reached out and grabbed onto his arm. Wait. I was thinking maybe we could stay here for a bit. Stopped in his tracks due to her grasp on him, he was forced to sit back down in front of her. Do you think we missed something? He questioned, though before he could get a response, he was dumbfounded by the sensation of her lips subtly pressing up against his. Before he could react, the girl gave off a soft moan as her tongue slid into his mouth, and she began to kiss him deeply. The two of them stayed locked in a passionate embrace for several moments, and it wasn't until Velma pulled back and took a step back that Naruto realized what was happening. Velma? He questioned softly. The auburn-haired girl moved some of her hair behind her ear as she pointed down to the bulge in his pants, the tip of her finger slightly brushing against it. I don't think this is easily explainable to the rest of the gang, she whispered softly. Naruto's eyes widened upon seeing the hint of her finger touching his beep, and he held his breath as he stared at the spot. I'm sorry. I know I shouldn't have been looking at you like that. It just sorta happened. He tried to defend himself sheepishly as she rubbed the back of his head. It's okay, she replied quietly as she stared at him through half-lidded eyes. If you want, we could take care of it before joining up with the rest? This caught Naruto completely off guard. Are you sure? I mean, we could get caught, and that'd be a terrible thing to try and explain. He chuckled. Velma shrugged softly as she placed the palm of her hand against his bulge, the heat in her core beginning to rise as she rubbed her hand against it. According to my calculations, we should be okay. I mean, we're locked in here and we don't know how to get out. Instead of just fumbling around looking for something that might not be here, we could, make the most of it? Naruto glanced back up at Velma with a confused expression. Make the most of it? The girl leaned forward and pressed her lips against his once again, this time, showing her intentions more clearly. She wrapped a hand around his neck as she kept beeping at his lips, an occasional breath of pleasure escaping her. Naruto was taken aback by the sudden kiss, but before he could resist, he found himself deep in the throes of another passionate kiss, her tongue swirling around his own as their bodies pressed tightly against one another. Their hands were roaming each other's clothed forms, groping over smooth skin and grabbing onto bare flesh. His heart raced as he continued to kiss her, unable to help but moan from the sensation as his fingers brushed against her beeps, feeling her hardened nipples as he played with them through the fabric of her sweater. He groaned as she moaned, biting down on her lip gently as she rubbed her hand firmly against his bulge. Neither had any idea what they were doing, both of them simply lost in the moment. They broke apart after several long moments of kissing, and Velma pulled away, giving the boy a lustful glare as she looked up at him. Sit down. Naruto gave her a gentle nod as he moved up to take a seat on the antique couch, and Velma got on her knees in front of him, kneeling down onto the floor, spreading open her legs wide. Her skirt rode up high, exposing her panties to him, a small smile coming across her face as she reached up to unbuckle his belt. He watched intently as she undid the buckle and pulled at the strings holding his pants together, pushing them down his hips as she reached up to undo his zipper, the sound of it being undone echoing throughout the small room as she released his beep from its confines. She grabbed it between her thumb and forefinger, stroking it slowly. Her eyes fixated on it through her glasses, surprised by how big it was compared to the size of the bulge she'd accidentally groped earlier during her quest to find her discarded glasses. Naruto shifted nervously as Velma gave his beep a few more strokes, the softness of her touch causing his beep to twitch slightly, eliciting a slight gasp from the auburn-haired girl. She looked up at him as she stroked it. Is this okay? Am I doing it right? Yeah, he murmured, his voice low as he gazed up at her through half-lidded eyes. You're doing great. Velma smiled softly as she leaned forward, pressing her lips against the tip of his beep, her warm breath washing over the sensitive head. Naruto gasped softly as she wrapped her lips around him, sliding her tongue along the underside of his shaft. She licked the length of his beep eagerly, the taste of it filling her senses as she bobbed her head up and down, beeping at the base of his beep. Velma moaned softly as she felt his beep slide deeper between her lips, her tongue swirling around the length of it as she beeped at it, her saliva dripping down his shaft as she continued to beep on it. The warmth of her mouth sent shivers through his body, her pelvis heating up as she took care of him. Naruto groaned softly, enjoying the sensation of having her mouth around him. MMPH. Velma moaned lightly as she continued to beep his beep, her head bobbing up and down his shaft as she went faster, taking more of him into her mouth. She swallowed around the girthy length of his beep, moaning softly as she did so, relishing the feeling of having such a large manhood sliding between her lips. Naruto couldn't help but groan as he continued to watch her, his mind racing. He'd always thought that she was beautiful, but now he realized just how much he wanted her. Just the mere sight of her made his heart race. The way her body moved as she beeped at his beep, the sounds of her voice, her hot breath washing over his beep, it all caused his beep to twitch, his pleasure building as he remained seated on the couch. It didn't take very long for his balls to start swelling, and eventually, he let out a loud gasp, his mind going blank as his orgasm hit him, beep shooting deep into Velma's mouth. His hips buckled as he climaxed, his beep pulsating, his body tensing as he shot load after load of beep into the girl's mouth. She gulped it down hungrily, swallowing it all as quickly as she could, trying her best not to choke on the thick load that was pouring from his beep. After a few seconds, Naruto's beep stopped twitching. He sighed heavily, leaning back against the couch. That was amazing. Velma giggled, smiling up at him as she stood up, wiping her mouth clean with the back of her hand. Deciding that he should return the favor, Naruto stood up much to her surprise. With a grin on his face, he lifted her up by the thighs and laid her down on the couch with her head up against the backrest and her feet on the ground. Easy there, she chuckled slightly as she watched him take the spot on the floor this time, his fingers moving to take a hold of her panties and sliding them down her legs to reveal her moist pink nether lips. Naruto shrugged softly, can't help it. He smiled up at her as he lifted her legs up onto his shoulders, half of her body practically defying gravity and only being held up by the support of his neck and shoulders as his head got closer and closer to her beep, to the point she could feel his hot breath against her uncovered beep. Her hands gripped the edge of the couch tightly, her breathing quickening as she watched him come closer, her beep throbbing in anticipation. Soon, Naruto was hovering directly above her, his tongue gently brushing against her folds before he pressed it against her opening. Velma moaned softly, her hips lifting off the couch as she arched her back, trying to get his tongue inside of her. Naruto obliged, pushing his tongue into her beep, his nose bumping against her clit as he pushed deeper. He began to lick her with quick, short strokes, his tongue flicking against her clit over and over again. Velma closed her eyes as she arched her back, her nails digging into the couch as she groaned loudly. She couldn't believe how good it felt to have his tongue inside of her, to feel it flick against her sensitive folds. His tongue slid deeper into her beep, causing her to moan loudly, her hips arching upwards as she tried to get more of him into her. Naruto rolled his tongue around her beep, rolling his tongue over her clit as he did so, making it impossible for Velma to keep silent. Her hips buckled as she cried out his name, her beep quivering beneath him. He kept doing it, driving her to the point where she was almost delirious with pleasure, her body shaking as the pleasure overwhelmed her. She reached down, grabbing his hair and pulling him deeper into her wetness. Naruto grunted softly as he struggled to breathe, his tongue continuing to swirl around her beep, his eyes locked on hers as they stared each other down, both of them completely lost in the moment. Velma came undone, shuddering as she cried out his name. Her body trembled as wave after wave of pleasure washed through her, her toes curling as she melted under the force of her orgasm. Her inner walls clenched around Naruto's tongue, squeezing it as he pleasured her, his tongue swirling around her insides until he finally pulled away, his tongue glistening with her juices as he licked his lips. "Oh my God, you're incredible," she gasped, gasping for air as she lay there, panting heavily, her body still tingly from the intense orgasm that had just rocked her world. Naruto smirked. "I can't help it if I'm good with my tongue," he replied teasingly, enjoying her flustered expression to the fullest. Velma laughed lightly, a blush rising to her cheeks as she looked down at him. "You're an expert with your tongue, Naruto." Naruto grinned widely. "Well, you know what they say about experts, right?" he teased, winking at her playfully. "What do they say?" Velma asked curiously, biting her lip as she looked at him. "They never share their secrets," he said with a wink, earning a small giggle from Velma, who couldn't help but be amused by how horrible his joke sounded in reality. Though in the given situation, and how out of place the joke was, she found it quite funny. Smiling up at her, he caressed the soft skin of her thick thighs. "Do you want to continue?" Velma shot him a quick smirk. "Have I pushed you away yet?" "I guess not." He chuckled softly as he moved up into a standing position, his arms wrapped around her legs so half of her body wouldn't just pummel to the floor. The tip of his member practically already pointed toward her beep. Velma blushed lightly as she watched him, her hands running up and down his back as he lifted himself up, her eyes fixed on the way his hard beep swayed between her legs. She swallowed audibly as he lowered himself down, her eyes widening as he gently pressed the head of his beep against her folds, his tip parting her outer lips. She bit her lower lip as he slowly pushed forward, his tip pressing against her entrance. "Are you all right?" he whispered, his voice raspy as he made slow circles with the head of his beep. Velma nodded. "Yeah." Naruto pushed forward even further, penetrating her tight heat, causing her to gasp softly as the burning sensation burned deeper within her. With a deep breath, she let go of her grip on his back, wrapping her arms around his neck as she met his gaze. "Ready?" he murmured softly, his eyes meeting hers as he pushed forward one more time, sinking all of his length into her. Velma moaned softly, her body trembling as she opened her lips. "Oh God, yes." Naruto leaned down, planting a soft kiss on her neck before he began to slowly move his hips back and forth, sliding his shaft in and out of her slick beep. He could feel her inner muscles contract around his beep, tightening and relaxing as he continued to thrust into her, his beep slipping in and out of her with ease. Velma closed her eyes, moaning softly as he entered her repeatedly, his beep sliding out of her and then plunging back into her wet depths. She gripped onto his shoulders tightly as he continued to fuck her, her beeps bouncing beneath her sweater with every thrust, her hard nipples brushing against his chest. Wanting to see more of her, Naruto released the grip on one of her legs for a moment to push her sweater and bra off her chest, letting her large and sensitive beeps bounce out into the open. He chuckled softly at the sight, mesmerized by them as he continued to thrust faster. Each thrust caused his crotch to pummel up against her body, her thick thighs and doughy ass cheeks jiggling around upon each impact in tune with her bouncing beep. Each time he would plunge inside her, she would let out a sharp gasp, her lips parted slightly as she tried to muffle her cries, her mouth hanging open as she moaned, her face flushed a bright red. Naruto groaned, his pace picking up as he picked up speed. He felt her inner walls tighten around his beep, squeezing it tight and milking the life out of him as he pounded into her over and over again. His balls drew up close to his body as he impaled her, his member throbbing as it slid in and out of her tight hole. Velma's moans grew louder the more he fucked her, her breathing heavy as she held onto his shoulders tightly, her entire body trembling from the intense pleasure that radiated through her. Naruto grunted, his thrusts growing longer and harder, each one causing her body to jolt and shake as he buried his beep into her tight depths. His balls repeatedly slapped up against her soft ass cheeks, making those audible wet slaps bounce throughout the room. "I'm gonna beep," Velma cried out as she felt the first wave of her orgasm crash over her body shaking as she was overwhelmed by the feeling. Her beep tightened around his shaft as her clit swelled up, the powerful waves of pleasure coursing through her body, threatening to send her into another orgasm. Her body tensed up, her legs clamping around his waist tightly as she struggled to hold back the next wave of pleasure, her mind beginning to race as she came down from the high. Naruto groaned, his thrusts becoming erratic as he slammed into her over and over again, his own climax building quickly. He dug his fingers into her thighs, his beep bucking wildly as he emptied his load into her hot and welcoming beep. His beep splattered into her inner walls, each spurt making her moan and whimper as she felt him filling her up. After what seemed like an eternity, his thrust slowed down to a stop and eventually stopped altogether. He leaned down, kissing her neck tenderly before he pulled out, allowing his spent beep to slip from her wet folds. Velma gasped as she felt his member leave her, her inner walls pulsating as it left her. She looked up at him weakly, her eyes glazed over with lust and desire as she stared into his eyes. "Round 2? Already?" he teased with a chuckle through a couple of hard gasps to catch his breath. She giggled softly as her face lit up. "Well, as you know, work can be stressful, so this is beneficial. Plus it's also really nice," she admitted through a giggle. Naruto chuckled as he moved behind her, leaning down to beeple on her beep as he groped her other one roughly, fondling her large, bouncy beeps. He stood up, his beep dripping with their combined juices as he helped her stand up, pushing her sweater and bra off once more. He kissed her neck softly. "Ready?" he asked. Velma smiled sweetly, always. Naruto gave her a quick grin as he took a seat on the couch this time, watching the beauty crawl up into his lap where his still hard beep would rest up against her stomach. The auburn-haired woman lifted her skirt up a bit so it wouldn't get in the way, letting it hang as a decoration around her stomach as she lifted her body to properly align his length with her wet folds once again. Naruto grabbed hold of her hips, steadying her as she lowered herself down onto his beep. She moaned as she felt him enter her again, her inner walls tightening around him as they became reacquainted. She held onto him for support as she slowly began to move up and down on him, her soft beeps swaying in tune with the motion, his hands going up to squeeze them as he watched her bounce on top of him, his fingers teasing her nipples roughly. It didn't take long for her to get into the rhythm, moaning softly as he slid in and out of her wetness. His beep was slick with her arousal, his shaft sliding in and out of her beep easily due to how wet she had made it. Velma leaned forward, bracing herself against his chest as she continued to slide up and down on his beep, her moans getting louder and more frequent. She rubbed her beeps against his chest, her nipples hard as rocks as they pushed into his skin. Naruto groaned as she started to pick up speed, her bouncing becoming quicker and more energetic. He wrapped his arms around her waist, holding her tight as she rode him, her beep pressed firmly into his hard pecs. His pelvis smacked against her ass as she bounced on him, the sound of flesh slapping together filling the room as he rocked her back and forth. Her moans echoed loudly throughout the living room, her breathing growing heavier as she moved faster, wanting to feel him inside her once more. Velma couldn't help but smile as she felt his hands squeeze her round ass, his fingers digging into her doughy cheeks as he pulled her closer to him. He leaned down, planting a kiss on her shoulder before he began to nuzzle her neck, his kisses becoming more aggressive as she moved even faster. NNNH, she groaned as he beeped on her neck, his thrusts picking up pace as well. Naruto smirked as she said that, his thrusts becoming more erratic and rough, slamming into her wet beep over and over again in with her bouncing on his length like crazy. Velma kept moving up and down on him, her lips quivering as she felt him pounding into her, his beep buried deep within her depths. The sudden change in tempo sent shivers down her spine, her mind filled with erotic thoughts as she continued to ride him, feeling his beep throbbing inside her. Naruto growled as he felt Velma tense up, her inner walls clenching around his raging erection. He grunted as he slapped her ass, his hands gripping her ass tightly as he jerked her back and forth, his beep throbbing inside her. Velma screamed as she came, her pleasure washing over her. She moaned as he kept hitting her, his beep twitching and throbbing as it spewed its load inside her. Naruto groaned as he slammed into her, his orgasm hitting him like a ton of bricks. He let out a loud grunt as he emptied himself inside her. His beep spurted out of his beep, coating her insides as he continued to jerk her back and forth. Velma cried out as she felt him erupt inside her, his hot seed shooting into her depths and causing her to beep again, her body shaking as she did. She felt like she could pass out at any minute, her body trembling from the intense pleasure coursing through her. After a few minutes, Naruto stopped, his breathing ragged as he collapsed onto the couch, giving her enough time to catch her breath as well. Once she was done catching her breath, Velma got off his lap and sat next to him on the couch, wrapping an arm around his neck and kissing him gently on the cheek. Naruto smiled as he wrapped an arm around her waist. Best day at the office, ever. Velma giggled softly, I agree wholeheartedly. They stayed quiet after that, enjoying each other's company as they basked in the blissful afterglow of beep, until Velma began fumbling after her bra and sweater. We should get dressed. Would be hard to explain if they came to let us out and just see us half naked. The blonde chuckled as he pulled up his boxers and pants, buckling his belt. True, I doubt Shaggy would ever be able to look us in the eye again. Merely thinking about it made her giggle softly as she slipped on her panties and readjusted her skirt, looking at herself in an old mirror to make sure her hair wasn't too messed up. They stayed down there just enjoying each other's company for about 10 more minutes before the sound of footsteps could be heard, and they stood up. A loud audible clank could be heard as the locking mechanism on the door was disengaged, and soon revealed Daphne on the other side. So this is where the two of you have been hiding all this time? Naruto rolled his eyes, more like locked up against our wool, but sure, you can call it that if you want. The woman rolled her eyes. Anyhow, we solved the mystery. Velma looked a bit surprised at that. Really? What was it? The red-haired woman laughed awkwardly. Son of the owner was mad that his father didn't want to leave the property to him, so to purposefully sabotage the property value he made sure it seemed haunted. There was a shed in the garden that Shaggy and Scoob stumbled upon, which had more than enough evidence. Really? Naruto asked with a deadpan expression. Daphne nodded. Oh yeah. Fred suggested we lured him in. Put up a quick trap, got a confession, and boom. Mystery solved once again. Velma had a very amused expression on her face. Good job. Would have loved to say we helped, but yeah, unfortunate circumstances. But we made the best of it, she said softly, the last few words leaving her mouth, causing her face to turn a bit red. Though as Daphne saw that, a knowing smirk came to her face. She might have been a bit clumsy and danger-prone, but she wasn't an idiot. The room reeked of a very certain scent. Oh, Velma, you got something white on your skirt down there. The auburn-haired girl's eyes widened as she looked down to immediately spot a piece of evidence. Oh, must be some paint or something. Looked like one of the rooms down here had just been painted. She rambled, trying to come up with an excuse. Sweating profusely in his spot, Naruto scratched his cheek. Let me go and find some paper so you can wipe it off. Had to be some in the kitchen or something, he said quickly as he skipped by the two women. Mentally cursing the blonde for leaving her behind, Velma turned her head to Daphne, who was just smirking at her with a rather intrigued and interested expression on her face. What? The redhead subtly licked the corner of her lips suggestively with that knowing expression on her face. So how was it? It had been about a week since the job at the mansion, and one could say that both Naruto and Velma had spent the majority of the week in the company of each other. They'd already made sure that they were clear on the fact that they weren't dating. They both figured they were busy with their own lives, so being exclusive to each other would have been a potentially toxic move both in regard to each other and to the team should the two have a falling out. However, that didn't stop them from fooling around every now and then. Quite on the contrary, they'd almost been caught by Fred one day at the office. They'd felt like taking a risk and ended up fooling around in the bathroom. Naruto had managed to hit a particular sweet spot at that moment that had made Velma almost cry out at the top of her lungs. At least the blonde saw it coming from a mile away and had promptly silenced her by shoving his tongue down her mouth, effectively muffling whatever sound she tried to make. The two of them had joked around a lot about it since then. It had been the source of a lot of banter between them. But if Naruto had to be honest, he'd begun to see them looking in their direction a bit differently. Even Shaggy had commented out loud that they seemed to be having more fun than before, and they'd tried to shrug it off saying it was the same as usual. Most of them had seemed to buy it, but Daphne always had that knowing smirk on her face. Anyhow, the week had passed swiftly. The two of them had been going at it, thus relieving a lot of stress. As Friday approached and they were gathered in their small office or base of operations as Fred liked to call it, they'd at first made a deal out of hanging out afterward, though Velma had been forced to cancel as something had come up. Can we just go home already? Shaggy whined slightly as he slumped over on the worn-out-looking couch. Fred shook his head. We're waiting for the mailman. There is a package coming over. I thought about some neat upgrades for the van, so Velma and I were browsing parts yesterday. It's scheduled to arrive today, so we should stick around so they don't just leave it outside. At that, Velma nodded her head and took a sip of a water bottle. Would be a shame if someone were to steal it. As soon as the mailman drops it off, it's not their responsibility anymore, so we won't be able to get compensated for our loss. Shaggy shrugged. I guess. So what kind of stuff did you guys find? Velma chuckled lightly, tapping her fingers on the table as she looked at her phone, before answering. Well, some of these are pretty sweet. We got some new tires for instance, so we'll have better grip and be safer on the road. Also, I found a set of radar detectors and a few more sensors that will help us detect abnormalities. I also found a cool little GPS tracker that will let us know where everyone's located in case of an emergency. What is this thing? Shaggy asked curiously as he picked up a small device. It was shaped like a car key and had a screen. Velma handed him the device. This is a GPS locator. It tracks your location and sends it to a receiver. You can place it anywhere, and it'll send its position back to our phones, allowing us to locate one another. As long as we're within range, we'll be able to track each other. That sounds handy, Shaggy said as he placed the device inside the pocket of his jeans. Plus, we're always split up. Exactly. Also, I got a few of those portable power generators. They're good for charging things while on the run or when we have no access to electricity. Sounds useful, Shaggy agreed. Of course it is. We've all lost our cell batteries at one point or another, and we tend to lose things easily. This way, we can charge things without wasting precious time hunting for a wall socket. Saving time is always a plus in my book. Naruto chuckled a bit as he gathered his hands behind his head. Just remember that you use it too, Velma reminded him. Oh, right, Naruto said sheepishly. As they shared their occasional banter, Daphne leaned back in her seat. Why don't you guys go home for the day? I can wait around here for the mailman for a little bit. I don't have much planned for the day regardless. Naruto looked over at her. Are you sure? Daphne nodded. Yeah. You guys need to unwind a bit and do some self-care. I don't really have anything planned today anyway. Thanks, Daphne. Shaggy exclaimed happily. You're the bestest. Daphne rolled her eyes, though she couldn't hold it in any longer, and burst out laughing. Don't get so excited. Alright guys, enjoy yourselves. I'll be fine. Fred gave her a nod of gratitude as he began gathering his stuff. Just give us a call if something comes up, alright? She nodded in return. Don't worry, it'll be fine. As Naruto listened in, he shrugged a bit. I can keep her company for a bit. More fun to be here than at home, so I might as well. Alright then. Fred said with a smile. Go ahead. The other 4 members of the gang soon began to leave slowly. Fred offered to give them a ride home, which they accepted. They wished each other a brief, good weekend, and, see you on Monday. Before all that was left was a slight silence, as Naruto and Daphne shared a few looks with each other. So, what are you doing today, Daphne? Naruto asked after a moment. Nothing in particular, she shrugged casually. How about you? Naruto smiled softly and took a deep breath. Not much, either. Just going to relax. I'm gonna grab a bite to eat and watch some movies. She tilted her head a bit. Movies? What kind? Well, I watched the first 2 episodes of this new show, he explained. It's pretty awesome. It's called Monster Hunter International, and it's basically a group of people who hunt down monsters. She raised her eyebrows a bit. Hunting monsters is your idea of relaxing? You do realize that's kinda our job already, right? She teased him as she walked over to sit down on the couch beside him. He chuckled a bit. Yeah, I know, but you know how it is, sometimes, watching TV is just more entertaining. Peeved. Sure, she said with a snort. Hey, don't knock it until you've tried it, Naruto insisted. Trust me, you'll like it. HMPH. Whatever, she replied. See? You should try it, he continued, it'll be fun. Alright, fine, Daphne relented with a hint of laughter. Great. Naruto exclaimed happily. Though as Naruto basked in the small victory, Daphne rested her head in the palm of her hand. So, you and Velma seem rather close recently. Anything I should know of? She asked with a small smirk. Naruto blushed a bit. No, nothing like that, he muttered awkwardly. Alrighty then, Daphne teased. We're not doing anything weird, trust me, Naruto assured her. Oh. She challenged. Like what? He scratched the back of his head. Well, Naruto hesitated a bit, looking away from her, I mean. She stared at him more intensely. What? Daphne pressed. Come on now, out with it already. Air. Naruto trailed off and scratched his cheek. Damn, Naruto, she laughed a bit. You can tell me. Naruto chuckled. My bad. Come on now, don't be like that, she said with a wave of her hand. It's okay. I'm just curious, is all. He raised a brow. Don't you know curiosity killed the cat? Daphne shrugged. Perhaps, but you gotta admit it's a bit suspicious. Right. Naruto trailed off again. The redhead rolled her eyes. There was sperm on her skirt, and the room you two were locked inside was reeking of beep. Come on, I'm not stupid. She trailed off, giving him a knowing look. Naruto froze in place. What? No, that was some paint, she said that, right? She smirked playfully. Yeah, that's what she said. But still, she got quite flustered when I asked her how it was afterward. Ah. Naruto trailed off, unsure of how to respond. Don't worry, I'll keep your little secret. She smirked as she rubbed her chin. For a price. Price? He questioned. If you want me to keep my mouth shut, you have to pay for it, she said with a mischievous grin. What do you want? He asked, trying to hide his embarrassment. She gave a simple shrug of her shoulders. I'm going shopping today. And you get to be my guest. Carry around what I buy. Tell me what you think of a couple of outfits. Simple as that. Naruto sighed. Deal. Good, she replied with a nod. Naruto stood up and stretched. Now then, I guess we better get going. We don't want to be late. True, very true, she agreed, standing up herself, though we still got a package to wait for. Stopping in his tracks, he rubbed the back of his head. Right. Guy Shing. After they'd signed for the package and put it in a safe place within the garage, they left for the mall. They decided to take Daphne's car, given that Naruto currently didn't own one of his own, and the car ride was slightly awkward. Well, Daphne was always happy talking. so there was never really a moment of silence. Even if she knew he and Velma had had beef, and probably suspected they were still fooling around, she was still almost the same. Though the occasional glance she'd shoot him was beginning to send shivers up his spine. Once they arrived at the mall, Daphne led them to several clothing stores, even though she only ended up buying 3 dresses. The redhead also bought a few pairs of shoes. Naruto felt obliged to comment on each dress because he found them cute. When they finally finished their rounds, Naruto was quite tired. But instead of heading home straight away, Daphne wanted to go somewhere else. By the time they'd reached the destination, it was already past 6 o'clock. Oh, wow, Naruto gasped upon seeing where they were headed. Yep, Daphne grinned, check this out. They entered a restaurant, which was located on the 2nd floor of an office building. It wasn't exactly a fancy place, but it was still rather nice. I thought you'd like it here, Daphne explained, I've been here once before. He raised a brow at her at that, and how did you know I would? Naruto asked curiously. It's just a hunch, she replied. Sure, whatever you say, he answered with a slight roll of his eyes. The server came over after a minute or two. Welcome, can I take your order please? I'll have the crab cakes and a side salad, she ordered. I'll have the burger and fries, Naruto added. The waitress nodded and left, taking their order. So, why did you bring us here? Naruto asked. Did you get a discount or something? Daphne shook her head. No, I just want to eat here with you, she said simply. Why? He asked. Why? Why what? She asked back. Why did you want to come here with me? She shrugged. Well, I think it's kinda obvious, she said with a smirk. Naruto let out a sigh. You're impossible sometimes. I know, she replied with a playful pout. While waiting for their food to arrive, Naruto leaned back in his chair and looked out the window. Outside, people were walking around, enjoying the evening air. A few minutes later, their meals were placed on the table, along with a basket of bread. Looks good, Naruto commented, picking up his fork. It is, Daphne agreed, picking up her knife. Naruto followed suit and began eating, while Daphne cut into her salad. They talked about various things during dinner, but nothing too serious. Which was kind of ironic given that she'd practically blackmailed him into spending the evening with her, but it had been surprisingly fun. He hadn't expected it, but she seemed to match his energy level when they were out relaxing like this. Often his parents would tell him he was too energetic and hyper to keep in check, but she seemed to match his pace quite well. So they'd had plenty of fun so far. When the bill arrived, Naruto groaned internally. He'd gotten used to living off of ramen and instant noodles, so eating out was a luxury he couldn't afford. But Daphne just smiled at his expression. Don't worry, she said softly, I already paid for our meal. Naruto blinked in surprise. What? My treat, she insisted. Why? She just stared at him. I was hungry, and didn't want to eat alone. Don't overthink it, she teased. With nothing else to do, Naruto accepted her offer. Though he was shocked when she actually pulled out her wallet and handed over cash to cover their meal. Wow, thanks, he said honestly, I can pay next time. Good, now we're even, she replied with a smile. They left the restaurant a little after 7 o'clock and headed to the parking lot. Once they were on their way home, Naruto noticed the odd look on Daphne's face. What's wrong? He asked, noticing her expression turn dark. Nothing, she said quickly, it's nothing. Just, we should head home soon, right? Yeah, sure. Naruto replied, I want to get to bed early tonight. Need to catch up on some sleep. Me too. She said, I'm beat. Though I have one more favor to ask, if you have the time of course. Sure. What is it? He asked. She rubbed her chin softly. Well, I got a reward for you. After all that hard work today, I thought you deserved it. Naruto waved his hands dismissively. Oh come on, you already paid for my dinner. Daphne gave him a suggestive look. Now, don't be shy. I'm sure you'll like it. Fine, but I'll be paying you back eventually. She shrugged. Oh you will. Sooner than you know. You say something. Oh no, nothing at all. Naruto rolled his eyes. Okay, fine. What is this reward you mentioned? Can't I just surprise you? She asked. If you must, he replied, watching her as if he was trying to get any clue of what she was referring to. If it's a Scooby snack, I'm going home. And of course, she played coy. As if she could read his mind. She smirked. Don't worry. I doubt I could bribe you like that. You'll see, when we get to my place. Naruto sighed. Alright then, keep your secrets. Gai Sheng. Once they reached Daphne's house, she let Naruto inside. It was a two-story building, with the first floor being occupied by the garage. A staircase led to the second floor, which contained all the rooms. The front door led directly into the living room, where there was a couch and an armchair. There was also a TV stand, where a flat-screen television sat. Next to the entrance was a large dining table, with enough seats for 8 people. On either side of the table were 4 chairs, and next to them was a small kitchen with a stove, oven, refrigerator, and sink. Welcome to my humble abode, Daphne said, taking her shoes off. Thanks, Naruto replied, following suit. Come on, I'll show you the rest. And so, they walked upstairs. The bedroom was larger than expected and contained a king-sized bed, a nightstand, and a dresser. Next to the bed was a large wardrobe, and near the closet were a desk and a chair, presumably for studying or reading. This is the bathroom, she said, pointing towards a door next to the closet. Naruto nodded. Cool. Not bad. It's not much, really. Still, better than most places I've seen. Daphne chuckled. You think so? Naruto chuckled as he rubbed the back of his head. My apartment looks like a fossil compared to this. Or like a museum. I swear, the kitchen must have been installed when dinosaurs were still roaming around. I thought you lived with your parents. Weren't they the reason you guys moved over here? Daphne questioned. The blonde nodded. Yeah, but apparently my dad got a promotion. So the chance of us staying here is pretty big. Figured I might as well get comfortable and find a place of my own. Sounds like you're going through a lot. It's not so bad, Naruto replied. Just means I gotta get used to living on my own. I guess, she commented. But hey, there's always a bright side. You get to live on your own, and you can finally decorate however you want. He smiled at her. Yeah, I suppose you're right about that. So how does it feel, having your own place? Pretty good, actually. He said, thinking back on the last few days. It's nice to have my own space. I kinda miss living with my family from time to time, though. Why's that? Well, my mom's the best cook in the world, and my dad would play video games with me until 3 in the morning. I'm gonna miss those times. That's sweet. Naruto nodded with a soft smile. It is something that makes me love them more. They're both great people. And yeah, I'm gonna miss them a lot. But I think I can deal with it. Good. They continued talking for a while longer before Daphne decided to call it. I suppose I shouldn't stall any longer. Let me go get your reward. Naruto sighed. You really don't have to reward me, it's completely fine. She pressed a finger against his lips gently. Shish, just go with the flow. Alright? He gave her a silent nod as she removed her finger. Good. Now wait here, I'll be right back. She giggled as she began moving toward the bathroom, bringing along one of the bags of clothes she'd bought throughout the day. With a slight grunt, Naruto scratched the back of his head again, waiting with slight impatience. He was starting to get an idea of what she might have in store for him, but he didn't want to assume anything. But he couldn't help but think about it. She'd spend the majority of the day shopping, having him check her out in all kinds of tight dresses and outfits that managed to bring out the full beepiness of her figure. Plus all the glances and teasing looks. He didn't want to assume anything, but he had a very good idea in mind of what he wanted to see the moment the bathroom door would open. And the mere thought was beginning to make him strain against the insides of his pants. A minute or two passed by, and Naruto began getting impatient. He couldn't stop himself from imagining the exact scene that was about to unfold. It was driving him crazy, and he felt his face grow hot as he tried to keep his cool. Then, suddenly, the bathroom door opened. And Daphne stood before him, wearing a purple, lacy bra, and matching panties. Her body looked amazing, and her hair was let down, now covering half of her face. Oh, he breathed out as his eyes widened and began to roam down her figure. Her legs were covered in sheer black pantyhose, which made them look longer and leaner. Her stomach was flat and toned, showing off some of the abs she worked hard to achieve. And the underwear she wore pushed up the curve of her beeps, giving them more volume. On top of that, the bra went perfectly with her outfit, and it left little to the imagination. The cups were thin and only held her beep together by a thin piece of lace that ran from her collarbone to the tip of her cleavage. The straps were also thin, leaving her shoulders bare. And the whole thing barely came close to covering her surprisingly large, heavy beeps. Naruto's jaw dropped as he took in every inch of her, before turning his attention to her face, where she was smiling at him. Wow, you look absolutely gorgeous. She blushed at his compliment. As for your reward, you get to be the judge of this. She giggled and motioned down her body. So what do you think? She asked sultrily, doing a small spin. Naruto blinked at the sight, as if in a daze. His brain was still trying to process the fact that she'd willingly stripped herself for him. Slowly, he began to move his gaze down her body once again. Yeah. I think you're absolutely stunning. Thanks. She grinned widely and moved forward, leaning in closer to him. She placed a hand on his shoulder, and her other hand rested on his arm. Naruto leaned in towards her, and they both shared a deep kiss. Their lips met with a loud smack, and their tongues began to meet, exploring each other's mouths. Naruto wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her even closer to him, as he ran his hands over her sides and hips. Daphne moaned softly into his mouth, kissing him more passionately than ever. Her hands started to roam up his chest, feeling the skin beneath the fabric of his shirt. And then she began to unbutton his shirt, making a slow pass across his body, exposing his well-built torso. She moaned again, breaking away from the kiss, and placing a hand on either side of his face, leaning in and kissing him deeply once again, using the brief pause to gather as much air as possible, so she wouldn't have to back away too soon. Once again, their tongues met, and their lips locked together like magnets. Daphne could feel his hands roaming down her sides and thighs, and she gasped as he gently squeezed her ass. But as quickly as their kiss had begun, it ended. She pulled back, breathing heavily as she looked at him. That was nice, right? I hope you enjoyed it. Naruto nodded, smiling at her. Yeah, definitely. Thank you. She smiled back at him. You're welcome. So, what do you say? Shall we continue? Naruto nodded. I accept my reward wholeheartedly. She giggled as she whispered, good boy, and moved forward, wrapping her arms around his neck and kissing him again. She pressed her tongue against his mouth, moaning quietly as she did. He could hardly understand the difference between her and Velma. While Velma had been more shy and hesitant at first, Daphne was like a lioness. He could feel her intent to tease him throughout the entire thing that was about to unfold. It sent shivers up his spine, as he could feel her slightly biting into his lower lip. Also their bodies, it was surreal. Velma was a bit plumper, with those thick thighs and doughy ass. Meanwhile, Daphne was tall and thin with a toned and apparently trained stomach, and long smooth legs, yet her beeps seemed like modern art that just managed to captivate his attention completely. Plus her choice of clothes. The purple lace matched her red hair so perfectly, and the pantyhose was equally feasting for his eyes to gaze upon. Enjoying yourself? She asked subtly as they separated once again, a string of spit connecting their lips. MMHM. Very much, he replied, as he brought his hand up her rear cheek, and gave it another good squeeze. She smiled at him before moving away from him, leaving him breathless. But when he tried to follow her, she held him back. No need to rush things, Tiger. And then she reached up and grabbed his pants, causing him to yelp slightly. What are you doing? Naruto asked, a little confused, but obviously pleased by her sudden advances. My turn to do you now. She smirked. Naruto just nodded and waited patiently for her to continue, feeling her ample fingers reach for his zipper. She slowly undid his belt and pants, pulling them off of him entirely. She then hooked her thumbs into the waistband of his boxers and slowly lowered them down, revealing his stiff member. Daphne couldn't help but gasp as she shot him a coy look. Oh my, no wonder Velma was walking around with a limp for the past few days. The sound of her voice only made him harder, and he felt his beep begin to twitch. With a smirk, Daphne wrapped her left hand around his shaft and moved down his body until she was kneeling on the floor. She took his penis in her hand, and stroked it up and down. Such a big boy. You know how to treat a lady, hum? Naruto looked at her with a chuckle after hearing her teasing. I am a gentleman after all. She grinned back at him as she moved her hand faster up and down his penis. She then placed her right hand on his balls and began massaging them gently. He moaned softly, enjoying the sensations that were radiating through his body. How do you like that? She asked, still stroking him off. Naruto's reply was an unintelligible growl as he sat himself down on the edge of her bed, as Daphne continued to play with his beep. After a couple of minutes, Daphne stopped moving her hand and instead started to lick the head of his member. Subtly flicking her pink tongue from below the tip and up, as if she was licking a lollipop. Naruto let out a deep grunt, as Daphne took his beep in her mouth and beeped on it gently. Her soft lips caressed his erection, and she quickly got used to its size, taking it deeper down her throat. His back arched as he felt the sensation of her warm mouth enveloping his beep, and he reached a hand behind him to grab the back of her head. His fingers tangled up in her beautiful red locks. Daphne let out a muffled moan as Naruto's beep hit the back of her throat, eliciting a giggle from her. She kept going at it, however, beeping on his beep like a pro. Naruto wasn't sure if this was normal, but she clearly knew what she was doing, and it seemed to be working well for both of them. As he watched her bob her head up and down his beep, he imagined what else she could do with this mouth of hers, and his imagination was running wild. His hands remained firmly on the back of her head as if he was afraid that at any moment she would stop. After a while of giving him blowjobs, Daphne finally pulled her head away from his beep, and shot him a quick look. "Why'd you stop?" he asked breathlessly. She licked her lips. "I figured we might have to experiment a little." She winked as she reached behind her to unclasp her purple bra, letting it drop down her arms to reveal her large gravity-defying beeps in all their glory. The subtle light of the lamp makes them almost glow. Naruto's heart skipped a beat as he stared at her beeps. Even though they were big, they weren't huge, but they were damn near perfect and firm. She giggled as Naruto went to move towards her chest, but she slapped his hands away. "Not yet." With a smile, she leaned forward and kissed his shaft, slowly licking up the length of it, before popping her mouth back on his beep. Once again, she had become accustomed to the size of his member. Naruto moaned deeply as she did this, and Daphne's lips moved up and down his beep. She then switched to using her hand and jerked him off at the same time, taking him as deep down her throat as she could manage. After a while, she figured it was time to begin her experiment. Grabbing her beeps, she pushed them up around his shaft and squeezed them as she moved them up and down in tune with her bobbing her warm and wet mouth on the tip of his hard member. Naruto's eyes rolled back into his skull as he felt the sensation of her beep rubbing against the sides of his beep, while her warm mouth moved up and down his manhood. MMPH, Daphne moaned softly as she felt his beep throb in her mouth. Her beeps were actually rather sensitive, and she loved the feeling of his member rubbing against them and her sensitive nipples. "Ah, fuck," he groaned loudly as he felt his orgasm approaching. Daphne smirked as she heard this. "Just hold on a little longer, big boy. I haven't even gotten to the good part yet." He groaned, but nodded. "Yes ma'am." Daphne smiled as she resumed her blowjob, slurping on his beep with fervor. His hands returned to her head once more, and he held her tightly to him, pressing his beep against her lips. This caused her to moan lightly, and she increased her speed. Soon, she felt his balls tighten up, signaling the start of his climax. Naruto groaned as she kept beeping on his beep, and within seconds, he exploded into her mouth. His beep shot into her mouth, coating her tongue and the roof of her mouth, before dripping down the sides of her mouth and down her rack. "Oh God, Daphne," he moaned softly as he felt the first wave of pleasure wash over his body. She pulled back, and opened her mouth wide, showing off the load of beep that was still inside of it. The thick white strands of his semen dripped down onto her beeps, and she looked up at him with an excited smirk. "So, how'd I do?" she asked teasingly before swallowing audibly. He smiled. "You're amazing." She giggled as she licked her lips. "And now it's your turn." He couldn't help but smile as he stood up. He grabbed her by the hips and lifted her up so she could wrap her legs around his waist. With that done, he carried her to the bed, laying her down on it, and climbing atop her. He grabbed her ankles and spread her thighs wide apart, positioning himself between them. Daphne giggled. "So what are you waiting for?" "Shouldn't I return the favor first?" he asked with a slight smirk. She returned the smirk and moved her panties to the side, allowing him to see her dripping slit. "As you can see, I'm already plenty wet. You have to know, it was torture waiting around all day." Filled with these thoughts in my head, it was damn near impossible not to relieve myself in the changing room when I was trying out clothes. "I bet," he said with a playful tone. "Well, I'll let you decide," she replied as she flipped herself over on her stomach, presenting her ass to him by propping herself up on her hands and knees. "Surprise me." Naruto's eyes widened slightly. "Oh my," he gasped out at the sight. The way those lace panties wrapped around her peach-shaped ass was so irresistible, like a gift just waiting to be unwrapped. Not wanting to just rush into it, he wanted to have a taste of all of her, and make sure that it'd last all night, and not just be over before they knew it. So he reached up and slid his fingers under the strings of her panties and slid them down her legs and pantyhose, a sharp breath escaping his lips as he watched her pink lips so close to his face. Grinning, he waited a bit. Seeing her face turned away, waiting for her eventual surprise, he wasted no time and practically shoved his face up between her ass cheeks, stabbing his tongue against her beep to give her all the surprise that she was so desperately craving. Ah! Daphne screamed out as she felt his tongue plunge into her beep. She grasped the sheets and arched her back, pushing her ass back against his face as far as she could. Her hands gripped the pillow beneath her, keeping her on her hands and knees, as she squirmed from the pleasure that his tongue was giving her. His tongue flicked rapidly across her clit, making her shudder as she bucked against him. He gripped both her ass cheeks hard and plunged his tongue in deep, licking her whole beep, causing her to moan loudly. Naruto enjoyed the sound of her moans, and pressed his tongue against her slit as far as possible, making her gasp. He kept thrusting his tongue inside of her until he felt her juices begin to flow out of her, coating his face. Daphne's breathing was becoming shorter as she continued to grind her hips against his face, moaning softly as he took control. Oh God, Naruto, she whispered softly, before gasping as he beeped on her clit again. He grinned as he pushed her legs back further, spreading her wider apart, and dove deeper inside her. He used his tongue to lap up her juices, savoring the taste of her sweet nectar as he slurped it up. Ah! Why you bastard, Daphne moaned out, burying her face into the sheets as it began to heat up. Naruto chuckled and began to beep on her clit harder, plunging his tongue in and out of her beep as fast as he could. Daphne's hips were trembling, and she was pressing her ass back into his face, desperate to feel him deep inside her, to experience every inch of him, and feel his warm tongue lapping up her arousal. NGH. MMPH, she cried out, feeling her orgasm rushing to the surface. Her body tensed up, and she clenched her muscles tightly as she came. Daphne felt Naruto's tongue and fingers work together to pleasure her, and she was lost in the sensation. She moaned loudly as her climax hit her, and spasmed uncontrollably on her hands and knees. Naruto kept licking her beep while she rode out her orgasm, and when it finally subsided, he pulled his mouth off of her beep and sat up. He looked over at Daphne, who had her head buried into the sheets, breathing heavily. That was nice, Daphne said weakly. You don't say? Naruto smirked. I take it you liked that. It was great, he nodded, but I want to do more than just eat your beep. More? She asked with a knowing look. Waiting a moment to respond, he knelt behind her, using his hands to spread open her ass cheeks to get another good glimpse before he retracted his hands to pull his shirt off and throw it far away. Not completely naked behind the beautiful redhead. Well? What's next? He asked as he leaned forward and placed his hands on her hips, or are you just gonna sit there and enjoy yourself? Daphne smiled playfully at him, and shook her head. No, I'm not done yet. She responded and reached down beneath her, to use her fingers to spread open her nether lips. Do you want me to spell it out for you? And if I said yes? He teased. The redhead rolled her eyes as she shot him a sultry gaze and whispered in a husky tone, I want you to fuck me, loverboy. You're such an exhibitionist, aren't you? He laughed. Daphne shrugged, it's fun. He nodded and then moved back to his position behind her doughy ass, sliding his beep back into place and rubbing the tip against her beep lips. His beep throbbed with desire and he couldn't wait to bury himself inside her, but he made sure to tease her some more first. Daphne moaned and whimpered as he teased her, his beep touching her beep only briefly before he withdrew it. She groaned as he did this several times, and she could tell that he was enjoying it too. The thought of him being turned on by this made her even hotter, and she knew she wanted more. Please, just do it, fuck me already, Daphne groaned. Naruto's smile widened as he gripped her hips tightly and pressed his beep against her beep lips, waiting for her to push back against him. When she didn't, he slid his beep inside of her slowly and allowed the head to slide into her tight folds. Oh, Daphne moaned and arched her back as he penetrated her. Fuck, I love it. Naruto held onto her hips tightly as he let the head of his beep enter her and then slowly sunk inside, inch by inch. Her beep was so warm and wet around his shaft, and he reveled in how tight she felt. He kept his pace slow, letting her adjust to him before he sped up. A little rough? Daphne asked, tilting her head to the side seductively. Naruto looked over at her with a smirk and whispered in her ear, you like that, don't you? Being treated roughly? She purred softly in response. He pulled out of her beep and started to thrust harder, slamming his hips into hers each time. Daphne gasped and moaned under the hot pressure of his thrusts. She loved how full she felt. Every movement sent waves of pleasure throughout her entire body. It was almost too much to handle, and she would have collapsed onto the bed if he hadn't been holding onto her hips, keeping her steady. Naruto growled as he pounded into her, loving the way her beep wrapped around him. Her juices were flowing freely from her beep and coating his beep, making it easier for him to slide in and out of her. He held onto her hips tightly, feeling her tighten up around him, and he released one hand to grab her beep. His thumb rubbed over her erect nipple as he plunged his beep deep inside her. Daphne arched her back and moaned loudly as she felt his thumb touch her sensitive nub. Yes, harder, she begged. Naruto slammed his hips into hers again, and she cried out in surprise as he bit down on her shoulder. She gasped and shivered slightly at the sudden pain mixed with pleasure, and he let her shoulder go. He continued to pound into her, driving his beep in and out of her so fast that she couldn't keep track anymore. Daphne moaned loudly, panting heavily as he fucked her hard and fast. "Oh God. You're big, so big, ah," Daphne panted. Naruto growled and grunted as he buried himself inside of her, and then yanked his hips back. He began to move faster, and Daphne moaned loudly as he forced her to beep. She let out a long, loud moan as she came all over his beep, and he was close to his own climax. He growled in satisfaction as he felt her beep tighten around him, and he pushed his beep inside of her as far as it would go. "Ah!" Daphne screamed out as he bottomed out inside of her. "Yes. Oh God, yes. I'm beeping." Naruto let out a low grunt as he felt himself getting ready to release, and his beep throbbed inside of her. He gritted his teeth and bit down on her shoulder once more. Daphne moaned loudly and started to scream as her orgasm took over her. Her beep clenched around his beep and the force of her orgasms caused her to push back against him. Her cries of pleasure filled the room as she clamped down around him, her body tensing up and her beep squeezing him. Naruto released her shoulder and grabbed onto her thighs, holding them tightly to keep her still. He thrust wildly into her as he came, and Daphne screamed out in delight. Her beep was milking his beep, forcing him to beep inside of her and filling her womb with his seed. As they both came down from their intense orgasms, Naruto pulled out of Daphne and laid next to her on the bed, panting. He was completely spent, and he could feel his beep twitching between his legs. He rolled over onto his back and looked up at her, smiling. "Well, that was fun," he said with a cheeky grin. Daphne giggled and sat up in bed. "Yeah, definitely, something we should do more often," she said with a smile. "Definitely." Naruto agreed. The redhead breathed heavily for a bit as she regained her energy, "Though if you aren't spent already, we could perhaps continue," she whispered as she rubbed his chest with her nails gently. Naruto smirked and leaned in to kiss her neck. "What did you have in mind?" Daphne reached down and grabbed his hardening beep, stroking it lightly. "I've got an idea," she murmured with a wicked look on her face as she pushed him down into the bed and climbed on top of him. The blonde looked up at her with amazement as he began stroking her legs through the pantyhose. "I think I like where this is going," he said with a wink. She smirked down at him as she lifted herself up to align her beep with his member once again, taking a deep breath to prepare herself before she sunk down on it, feeling it fill up her depths once more. Daphne moaned softly as she sank down on his beep. "So good," she purred as he slid in deeper. Naruto groaned and wrapped his hands up around her beeps, giving both a tight squeeze. "God, you feel amazing," he muttered. She smirked and started moving her hips slowly, sliding up and down his shaft. She moved her hips in a circular motion, teasing him by letting just the tip of his beep inside of her. Daphne let out a soft moan as she began moving faster, rocking her hips in a steady rhythm. Keep doing that, it feels so good," Naruto moaned as he watched her ride him, his eyes locked intently with hers. Daphne gave his beep another slow stroke, and she smiled as she felt his balls hit her ass. "You really are insatiable, aren't you?" she teased him. He chuckled. "Hell yeah. You're incredible," he groaned. Daphne slowed her movements, and she started grinding more forcefully now. She leaned forward slightly, pressing her chest against his. She looked down at him as she continued to ride him, and he groaned when she pushed her beeps into his chest. "MMPH, Daphne moaned softly as she pounded herself on his beep. "So good." Naruto grunted and grabbed her waist, pulling her down towards him. He began thrusting his hips upwards, meeting her downward movement. She let out a loud gasp as her beeps bounced against his chest. "Ah, Fuck me harder. Fuck me. Naruto couldn't help but smile at how eager she was to fuck him. He grabbed her hips and pushed them down further, slamming himself into her as he slammed his beep deep inside of her. He could feel his balls slapping against her ass, and the feeling made him go wild. He grabbed her hips and bucked his hips, driving his beep deep inside her. Ha, ah, Daphne cried out as she felt his beep hitting the deepest parts inside of her. Naruto kept pounding away at her, as fast and hard as he could. Each time his beep went inside of her, it stretched her beep out wider. The friction of her beep walls gripping his beep sent shivers up his spine, and he was ready to blow at any second. Oh God, Daphne, I'm gonna beep, he growled. Daphne was close to her own orgasm, and she let out a loud moan, beep inside of me, fill my womb with your seed. Naruto gritted his teeth and held her hips, bucking them back down as he shot rope after rope of beep deep inside of her. As soon as he had beep, he collapsed beneath her. The sensation of his seed splashing against her womb sent the redhead over the edge, and she let out a loud moan as she came all over him. After a few seconds, Daphne finally stopped beeping, panting heavily as she lay on top of him. She kissed his cheek and rested her head against it, breathing heavy. The next morning, Daphne woke up first, and she peeked out from under the covers. She saw that Naruto still hadn't woken up yet, and she grinned at him. She crawled out of bed and slipped into her robe, slipping out of her room and making her way downstairs. She found the kitchen empty, and she walked in to start cooking breakfast. As she cooked, she thought about what they were going to do today. They didn't have much planned, so she wasn't sure what to do with their day off, but she figured they might as well spend some time together. She heard someone come down the stairs, and turned around, chuckling softly at the young blonde man whose hair was looking more messy than usual as he rubbed the sleep out of his eyes. He was just wearing his boxers and his shirt, yet it was still enough to make her hunger for potential more fun later. Naruto yawned and rubbed the sleep out of his eyes, blinking as he saw her. He looked at her curiously. What's so funny? He asked. Daphne shook her head and rolled her eyes, smiling brightly at him. Nothing. Just thinking about what we should do with our free time, she said. Naruto sat down at the table as she puttered around the kitchen. I don't know. What do you want to do? Daphne hummed. Well, I'd like to hang out with you today if possible. Maybe watch some movies or something. We could also go for a walk through the park. Naruto nodded as he took a sip of coffee. Yeah, sounds good. She glanced over at him. It does. Really? He shrugged. Sure. Why not? Daphne giggled as she began to smile. Good. Then I can cook us breakfast, and we can eat while watching our movie. The blonde smiled slightly as he let out a teaseful whistle. Sounds great. You sure you can handle cooking for two? Daphne laughed at the teasing. Haha, yeah. I'll be fine. It's no big deal, she said. Naruto raised a brow at her. You sure you don't want a hand? Daphne smiled as she headed over to the stove. You want to help me make breakfast? Naruto nodded. The least I can do after such a generous reward. The redhead blushed a bit as she rolled her eyes. Keep talking like that and you might find yourself earning more rewards. A couple of days had passed since Naruto had received his reward from Daphne. Well, it wasn't really a proper reward, but who cares? They had plenty of fun that night, and they'd even met up a handful of times since. She was beginning to tease him a lot more, even around the rest of the gang. Some of the others had questioned it for a second, but she'd played it off by simply saying it was because she'd gotten to know him a bit more that day they'd been waiting for the mailman. She of course left out the part where they had beep at her place, and the fact that she was aware of what he and Velma had been up to. So, it managed to satisfy the curiosity of the gang. Though, Velma couldn't quite help but look weirdly at them. The girl was smart, and by no means stupid, so she could read between the lines, and quite soon figured out that something had happened that Friday, and she was beginning to feel a bit jealous. Perhaps it was her own fault for not saying they were exclusive, like a proper relationship, but that didn't mean she was just going to give up. In fact, she started to try a few things on her own in order to get him back into her arms, or better yet, her bed. It was really difficult, having to compete with someone who you knew well, and now she had to do this while everyone else also watched. On another note, she decided to stop wearing the same clothes every day. She wanted to try and excite him by wearing something new. So one day at the office she was wearing a tight black tank top instead of her usual sweater. She still wore a matching skirt, but she definitely caught the blonde's gaze more than a few times that day. But he hadn't said anything. It was almost time for her lunch break, and she decided to take a walk down to the kitchen, but she stopped by the bathroom before heading that way. She looked through herself in the mirror and smiled. The tight shirt gave her nice cleavage, though she'd always had a pretty decent rack anyways. Her hair was pulled back away from her face, and she put on her normal glasses that made her eyes seem bigger. The outfit was definitely a step above her usual wear. She opened the door to go downstairs when she heard voices. "Hey, where are you going?" a voice asked. Velma turned around to see the blonde grinning at her. "I'm just gonna grab something to eat." He smirked. "Oh really? I'll come with ya then." "Okay." She smiled at him, and subconsciously began to put a bit more sway in her hips. She loved the way he looked at her, especially dressed like this. He walked beside her as they got to the kitchen. He sat down at the table, and she grabbed a plate and went over to the fridge. Though as she reached to open it, she felt a presence behind her along with the sensation of a hand beginning to slide up her thigh and up her skirt. Velma shivered slightly, and turned around slowly, smiling at the blonde boy. "What?" "Nothing," she grinned at him as she leaned forward to kiss his cheek. Then she stepped closer to him and pressed her body against his, and kissed him. He kissed back eagerly for a moment, and then pulled back from her. Naruto chuckled a bit as he placed his hands on her hips. "Nice top. It's been distracting." His sweat dropped as she scratched the back of his head. "Thanks. I just thought it would be fun to change it up a little bit." She smirked with a wink. She smiled at him, and began to move her hand around to his chest. She trailed her fingers up and down his abs, and she felt him shiver under her touch. She traced her nails along his waist, and slid her hand up the front of his pants, feeling how hard his beep was. She couldn't help but smirk at the thought. Naruto groaned a bit as he felt her hand tease his growing bulge. "We probably shouldn't do this here. Fred almost caught us the last time." "Well, we're already doing it, aren't we?" She smirked again. Naruto smirked at her. "Yeah, but," his voice trailed off as she began to unbutton his shirt, revealing his muscular chest. She paused for a second, and then pushed the shirt off of his shoulders. She let the shirt fall to the ground and she looked down at his body. He had nice abs, and his pecs were large enough to make her mouth water. A soft sigh left his lips as he grabbed a hold of her wrist and began to drag her out of the kitchen and toward a closet in the hallway, grabbing his shirt on the way. A small space that they used to store cleaning supplies and brooms. Closing the door gently behind him, he shook his head and dropped his shirt onto one of the shelves. "You're quite straightforward today." "Well, you weren't exactly subtle earlier, were you?" she teased him. He lowered his head with a chuckle. "I guess not." "So what's the plan?" she asked as she began to unzip his pants, keeping eye contact throughout it all. Naruto shrugged. "I dunno, I think you should decide what happens next." Her smile grew wider as she slipped her hand inside his boxers, and wrapped her fingers around his shaft. It was noticeably larger than last time, and she began pumping it slowly. He moaned a bit as she started to stroke him, and she leaned in close to whisper in his ear, "I want to feel you inside of me, Naruto." The blonde boy didn't say a word, and instead simply nodded. Velma continued to tease him for a while longer, until finally she pulled her hand out. She pulled him closer to her, and kissed him deeply. She squeezed his shaft between them, and he groaned softly into her mouth. "Though, we should be quick. How about after work, we go to your place? And we can get to know each other a little better," she offered with a suggestive gaze. The blonde smirked back at her. "Sounds like a plan to me, but you still have to take care of this first," he responded as she motioned down to his growing bulge. She let out a soft giggle. "Don't worry, I'll take good care of it," she whispered as she knelt down in front of him, slipping her fingers into his boxers to pull both his pants and underwear down to his ankles, freeing his hardening beep. It made her feel all hot inside, knowing that they were doing stuff like this in a place where they could easily get caught. They'd had beep in the bathroom before, but this was a closet. There wasn't even a lock on the door, so if they made too much noise and someone decided to come check it out, they'd be caught in the middle of the act. But Velma didn't seem to mind as she took his beep in her mouth, her tongue swirling around the tip of his beep and his balls. She licked up and down the length of his shaft, her eyes locked onto his as she beeped on it. Naruto let out a satisfied moan. That feels really nice." Velma hummed in agreement as she bobbed her head up and down, beeping him off. She beeped harder, her tongue swirling around the tip of his beep. Naruto shuddered as he held her head against his crotch, and began to thrust his hips a bit, fucking her face. Velma beeped him off with more intensity now, and she relished in the feeling of his shaft sliding over her tongue. Her cheeks hollowed out as she swallowed his beep down her throat, and she moaned around it as she enjoyed the sensation. She could taste his pre-beep, and it only added to the pleasure she was receiving from it. She pulled away a little, and let his beep slide out of her mouth. She brought her hands up to his thighs, and began to stroke him off slowly as she stared into his eyes. "God. That's so hot," Naruto groaned as she stroked him. She giggled at the sound of his voice. "I'm glad you like it. I've been practicing." "Practicing?" he questioned with an eyebrow raised. "Yes, just to make sure I get everything right for when we do this," she admitted. His smile grew wider. "I don't doubt that." Velma smiled back at him, "And I think you like my practice, don't you?" "Oh yeah," he agreed. She leaned in close to him. "Then how about we continue our practice?" she said suggestively. Naruto nodded, and she wrapped her arms around his waist, and wrapped her lips around the tip of his beep again. She took him deep into her throat, and moaned around him as she did. His beep pulsated as she slid him in and out of her mouth. Naruto closed his eyes and gripped her hair tightly in one hand, while the other rested on her head. He continued to thrust his hips as she beeped on him, and he let out a long sigh as he felt himself about to beep. Velma knew he wouldn't be able to hold back much longer, and she looked up at him seductively. "Do you want me to swallow it?" she asked. He nodded, and she pulled her mouth off of him. He quickly grabbed her by the shoulders, and pressed her against the wall of the closet. He thrust his hips forward, and shot his load straight into her waiting mouth. Velma swallowed every drop of his beep. When he finished, she leaned back on her knees and grinned up at him. "There, now that wasn't so bad, was it?" she teased. Naruto laughed. "Nah, not at all," he replied as he wiped the sweat off of his forehead. With a soft chuckle, Velma slurped around his shaft to clean him up, before helping him readjust his clothes. Standing to her feet, she looked herself over in the reflection of one of the windows. "Only a few hours left, and we can continue." She winked at him, as she opened the door to the closet and prepared to exit. Naruto laughed and scratched the back of his head as they began walking back to the kitchen. "I can barely wait. I quite liked the appetizer." Gai Xing. About 10 minutes prior, a certain redhead had been walking down the hallway. She heard Velma was going to go eat her lunch and thus decided to join her once she had finished some work. Though when she got to the kitchen, there was no sign of Velma or Naruto. She'd heard them talk on the stairs about him joining her, so when she found the room empty, she began getting suspicious. So she'd walked around the hallway, and a very subtle noise from the closet with their cleaning supplies caught her attention, and she walked over and pressed her ear against the door. Her eyes widened almost instantly as she could easily tell what was going on inside. The slurping sound on top of the blonde's deep moans, and the occasional banter between them. Velma was beeping him off, and in the middle of work at that. Daphne brought a hand to her mouth to silence her laughing as she backed away from the door, completely surprised, but she had to admit that she was impressed. She'd definitely noticed the rather jealous glances that Velma had been shooting her whenever she'd been overly friendly with the blonde man. "Well played, though I'm not going to lose that easily," she spoke to herself in a quiet tone, as she backed away into the kitchen. She knew she'd made a deal with him earlier the week to help him out with decorating his apartment, and everything else that was supposed to go along with that kind of arrangement. Though what she didn't get to hear was that the blonde was going to have more than just her company in the afternoon. The rest of the day seemed to pass without issue. They filled out some reports, restocked some supplies they were lacking, and soon everybody was beginning to head home for the day. Daphne stayed behind to finish packing up a couple of things, and then she locked the doors and headed out to her car. As she drove away from the building, she couldn't help but feel a bit of excitement brewing inside her. Knowing that Velma had just been blowing him off earlier, fueled her with a newfound energy. There was nothing like friendly competition, after all. As she reached the blonde's apartment complex, she exited her car and began walking up the steps. She climbed up to the 4th floor, and prepared herself to knock on the door, though she stopped in the middle of her tracks upon a loud sound from inside the apartment. Her eyes widened once again, as she realized she'd caught them, again. Slapping a hand over her mouth, she burst out laughing and shook her head. "Well played, Dinkley, though I'm not that easily beaten." Reaching for the doorknob, she began twisting it to see if it'd open, and when the audible click led her to opening the door, she smirked to herself and allowed herself entry. Dropping her bag on the floor in the hallway, she snuck through the apartment, following the sounds. Once she reached the living room, her eyes widened slightly as she saw where the noises were coming from. Naruto was sitting on the couch, and Velma was kneeling right in front of him, as she took his beep into her mouth. Her lips wrapped around his thick shaft, and her tongue ran up the underside of his length. She bobbed her head up and down, her hair bouncing all around her face. Daphne watched as he grabbed her hair and pushed his beep deeper down her throat. His hips thrust forward repeatedly, until she felt his balls tighten up. Velma kept beeping him off, even as her body tensed up with the impending orgasm. A low moan escaped her lips as she continued taking him into her throat, each time his beep hit the back of her throat. Naruto groaned loudly, and began thrusting into her face rapidly, as he was seconds away from beeping. His hands gripped her hair tightly as he continued to fuck her mouth with his beep. His hips buckled, and Daphne watched as he unloaded a massive load down Velma's throat. He held her there for a moment, letting it all come out of his beep before pulling out of her mouth. With a loud grunt, he pulled his beep from her mouth. Figuring it was time to reveal that she was there, Daphne crossed her arms under her chest and let out a loud whistle. Damn, this is better than beep. The two of them turned towards the direction of the whistle, and Daphne immediately recognized the look of shock on Velma's face. Naruto himself almost immediately went to cover his crotch. Which was a bit stupid, considering both the women had already more than seen it before. Though it was done instinctively, so he didn't think further about it. Daphne? What are you doing here? He questioned as a drop of sweat rolled down the side of his face. She smirked down at them as Velma's face continued to heat up. Well, we were supposed to work on decorating your apartment today. Imagine my surprise when I saw that you already had company. I'm hurt, you should have invited me. The two women began to stare at each other, as the blonde realized that they were both probably more than aware that they weren't the only one that had been fooling around with him for the past couple of weeks. So, what now? The blonde questioned with uncertainty. Velma looked just as unsure as Daphne's heels clicked against the floor, and she approached the blonde. Surprising the two others, she almost immediately wrapped her fingers around his hard length. The redhead gave the auburn-haired woman a sly smirk. Well, he is already hard, would be a shame to let it go to waste. Hold on, I was here first. Velma chipped in as she stood to her feet. Staring at the two nervously, Naruto stood to his feet and waved his hands defensively. Come on, we can talk this out, and figure out what to do. Ignoring him completely, Daphne just kept fondling his beep with her fingers. So? Why don't we make it interesting? Velma raised a brow as she stood beside the redhead. What do you mean? How about we have a little game? Daphne suggested with a sultry gaze. Standing confused, Velma crossed her arms beneath her generously sized bust. What kind of game? Daphne shrugged a bit as she shot a look up at Naruto, who looked equally confused. Simple. We see who can make him beep in the shortest amount of time. Whoever does that wins, and gets to go first. Deal. Velma responded firmly. The blonde tried to appear calm, but he couldn't help but feel his heart rate increasing. Sure. He mumbled out as he scratched the back of his head. This wasn't what he'd imagined would happen, but then again, who was he to complain? All of this more than benefited him. Both women leaned into him, and the three of them walked over to the bedroom. It didn't take long before they were all lying on the bed together, naked, and ready to begin their little challenge. Naruto laid on his back while Daphne positioned herself between his legs, and Velma lay down beside him. After that, the two women began stroking his beep simultaneously. I'm going to beat you, Daphne. Velma spoke confidently, as she started jerking his beep. No way, I'm sure that I'll win. Daphne replied in a similar tone as she began pumping his beep as well. Naruto's eyes widened as the two of them continued to work him over. Neither woman bothered to actually give it all that much effort, and he found himself getting harder and harder by the minute. By the time he'd gotten fully hard, Velma removed her hand as Daphne got ready to give it her shot. Wasting absolutely no time, she undressed herself and tossed her clothes into the corner of the room until she was just wearing her underwear. A simple green bra with matching panties. She smirked up at him and licked her lips, and grabbed a hold of her chest. Aiming it down at the tip of his length, she slipped his member up between her beeps, using the hold of the bra to make sure the warm and soft flesh mounds were firmly wrapped around his length. Diving her mouth down, she wrapped her red lips around the exposed tip of his beep, and began to work him, bouncing her soft beep up and down his length, whilst beeping him hard. The redhead loved giving head to Naruto. It was one of her favorite things to do, and the fact that she got to keep him nice and hard while she did made it even better. After a few minutes, she slowed down her suction, and instead began to bob her head back and forth, her tongue swirling around his shaft repeatedly. Naruto could hardly believe how good that felt, though he didn't dare speak out too much, or say anything for fear of ruining the mood. And he knew that Daphne wouldn't be very happy if he interrupted her right now. The woman was very competitive, and she was apparently dead set on winning this little contest. Slowly, but steadily, she sped up her motion, and soon Naruto couldn't hold back any longer. His beep twitched and pulsated within the hot confines of Daphne's cleavage, and in an instant it erupted with its load. Daphne closed her eyes and moaned as she continued to beep him off, getting every last drop of his beep out of his manhood. When she finally stopped, she removed her mouth from his beep, and sat back on her knees, smirking up at him. Velma, who'd been holding her phone, clicked on the timer and narrowed her eyes at the time. Knowing she had to beat the numbers she was staring at, began to make her unsure, though she wasn't one to give up. As Daphne crawled off the bed and took the phone this time, Velma looked him over as he laid there, his beep still hard and standing upright, and just waiting for more attention. Knowing she had one trump card she'd been wanting to try out, Velma figured that now was as good a time as any. Plus she didn't want to just copy Daphne and give him another tit job. That felt like it'd just be cheating. She smiled and rolled onto her hands and knees and let her ass into the air at the end of the bed. "Be a sweetie and get behind me, will you?" Naruto scratched the back of his head out of confusion, but complied as he climbed off the bed and stood at the foot end of the bed, looking completely surprised as Velma reached back and took a hold of his beep, and placed the tip between her thick thighs. At that, Daphne hit the timer on the phone and nodded at Velma, as the auburn-haired woman slid his member through her thighs. "Oh God. Oh wow," Naruto mumbled as he saw the way his beep disappeared into the tight valley of Velma's thick thighs. He could already tell that he was going to have a hell of a time today. Two beautiful women competing over him like this. That wasn't what he'd expected would happen after he moved away from Japan. "MMHMM. Bet you can't last long, babe," Velma said as she began to pump his beep in and out of her thighs, her ass bouncing against his crotch as she gave him a thigh job. Naruto was in heaven. Between the two of them, they weren't really trying to please him. They were just competing over who was going to make him beep first. And he knew that he definitely couldn't hold out, not when Velma was pumping his beep so well. He wanted to thrust so badly, but he knew he couldn't. It wouldn't be fair, given that the two women were competing, and it'd give Velma an unfair advantage. So he was forced to just stand there whilst gritting his teeth as the glasses-wearing woman bounced her jiggling thighs all over his member. Velma was panting hard, throwing herself back and forth with all the force she could muster, feeling his beep grinding through her thighs and seeing the tip of his beep poking out each time her ass smacked against his body. "I'm gonna win," Velma panted as she leaned forward onto her hands and began to bounce harder and faster. "You're gonna lose." Daphne rolled her eyes as her gaze flickered between the two of them, and the phone in her hand, watching the timer count, as Velma did her best to win. The redhead had to admit she was impressed. A thigh job wasn't even a thing she had considered, but perhaps she should remember that for the future. But the fact that her rival was getting to ride Naruto's beep in such a manner was making her jealous, and she began to rub her own beep as she watched the auburn-haired woman. After another minute or so, Naruto breathed out heavily as he was pushed over the edge, his shaft throbbing between Velma's thigh before he came, shooting his load all over the woman's legs and across his bed. Releasing him from her hold, Velma dropped down on the bed and wiped her forehead, looking at Daphne for the result. The redhead soon began to smirk as she tilted the phone around and showed her the time. "Seems like I win." Naruto looked between the two before he looked at the phone. Daphne had just managed to win with about 20 seconds on Velma's time. The auburn-haired woman clicked her tongue a bit. "I'll win the next time." "Oh, I'm sure you will, but you have to admit, this is rather fun," Daphne cooed as she leaned down and took the glasses off of Velma's face, watching her friend's confused expression before she brought the other girl into a kiss. It wasn't that any of them was bi-bi-poil, but apparently, they were having their fun. Naruto's eyes widened in surprise as the two women soon began to make out right in front of him. Truth be told, he'd been a bit scared that either of them would be sad for losing the bet, but it seemed like he had no reason for worry. The two were more than content, even if one of them had just lost. He'd never understand women. After a couple of minutes, the two broke apart panting heavily, both of them smirking at each other, as Daphne turned to Naruto. Now, for my prize. Go lay down, Blondie, you're going to enjoy this. As Naruto laid back, Daphne climbed up onto his lap, lifting her body as she pressed the tip of his beep against her wet beep, letting her sensitive nether lips spread across the crown of his member as she lowered herself down. Her entire body shuddered with pleasure as she felt him fill her up once again, as she let out a soft moan. Her body shivering as she slowly rose and fell, her wet beep sliding along his shaft, as she moved in perfect sync with him, her hips moving forward and back as he bottomed out inside of her. The redhead giggled a bit as she looked at Velma, who was biting her lip out of jealousy. Hey Velma, get over here. I got an idea. She mumbled out, using her finger to motion the girl over. Raising a brow, Velma scooted over and leaned her ear against Daphne's lips, as she whispered something to her. Naruto looked at the two of them, unable to hear what had been said, but knowing Daphne's personality, it was about to get really interesting. Velma's face instantly lit up, completely red. But, at the same time, there was a rather sultry look on the woman's face as she crawled across the bed. Naruto was about to question what she was doing, but his blue eyes widened in surprise when she climbed directly onto his face with her body facing in Daphne's direction. At the same time, the redhead licked her lips. Go on, Goldilocks, give Velma her prize as well. Taking his cue, Naruto began to lick and beep at the woman's beep. Velma moaned softly as she leaned her head back. Oh yeah, that's good, she groaned out. Daphne smiled, feeling rather satisfied. She'd won the bet, and she knew that it wasn't the only game she had won, but she couldn't help but feel quite pleased with herself. Especially after seeing how much her friend had enjoyed it. Naruto continued to lick and beep at the woman's beep as Daphne continued to ride him. The redhead's beeps bouncing up and down in the air as her body slapped down against his crotch as his beep were repeatedly buried in the depths of her gushing slit on repeat. Meanwhile, Velma was shaking uncontrollably above his face, using her hands to grasp onto Daphne's shoulders for support as she felt Naruto's tongue dig around inside of her. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore, and let go of Daphne's shoulder. Before she could fall, however, the redhead quickly grabbed her by the waist and held her steady. She didn't know why she felt so aroused by the situation. It was simply weird to see someone else on top of her lover, but she couldn't deny that it was making her feel very hot. She may not have been able to admit it, but she was enjoying it. Not wanting to waste any time, Velma moved up and straddled Naruto's face. Grinning at the sight of Velma riding Naruto's face, Daphne let out a quiet laugh. Well, looks like we both got our prizes. Velma moaned quietly as she started to bounce up and down faster, her body quivering with delight as she came ever closer to climax. Yeah, just like that. That feels so fucking good, Daphne moaned out, her voice turning into a husky moan as the pleasure grew stronger. Her body jolted up and down as she rode Naruto's beep, her ass slapping against his crotch. His beep was coated in her beep juice now, and yet even though it had become slick, she was still getting a great deal of friction as her beep rubbed against his beep. I'm gonna beep. Daphne groaned out, her body quaking as she neared her peak. Naruto smirked, pushing himself up and grabbing her hips tightly. He lifted her up, slamming his beep deep inside of her as she screamed out in ecstasy. Her body shook violently as she came. Oh fuck. I'm beeping too. Velma shouted, her own orgasm rushing through her as she came hard against Naruto's face. As they both orgasmed, their bodies jerked and twitched. Daphne's beep contracting around Naruto's beep as her body convulsed. Meanwhile, Velma was beeping on Naruto's face as he continued to eat her out. Feeling Daphne's insides get tighter and tighter, Naruto couldn't hold himself back any longer. His load burst up inside Daphne's unprotected beep, emptying his balls in the depths of her body. Both women grunted loudly, moaning in unison as Daphne's beep milked Naruto's beep, milking every last drop of beep from his balls. Finally, as their orgasms subsided, the three collapsed onto the bed, panting heavily, recovering from their intense climaxes. As Naruto laid there between the two beauties, he soon felt his head turn in Velma's direction. I hope you aren't done yet. I still want my turn. A smirk lifted the blonde's lips as he sat up. Wouldn't dream of disappointing you. Daphne chuckled a bit as she waved at them. You two have fun. I think I'll catch my breath for a second. Gotta use the restroom. The redhead stood up off the bed, taking a moment to straighten her clothes before heading towards the bathroom. Velma saw Daphne leave out of the corner of her eye and then focused back on Naruto. Moving onto her hands and knees on the bed in front of him, Velma wiggled her ass suggestively at him. I have an idea, if you want to try something new? Naruto grinned, kneeling on the bed behind Velma. He reached down and cupped her ass firmly, pulling her towards him. What did you have in mind? Blushing heavily, Velma reached behind her and in between them, guiding the tip of his beep between her ass cheeks. While he'd normally expect her to place him at her beep, she surprised him by going just a few inches above. Do you maybe want to try it here? Naruto's eyes widened in surprise as he felt her press the tip of his beep against her asshole instead of her dripping nether lips. You sure? MMHMM. Velma whispered back, giving a nod. Naruto took a moment to prepare himself, and then slowly pushed the tip against her puckered hole. You've been experimenting a lot today, a thigh job, and now this? Velma giggled a bit as she grit her teeth, feeling her asshole getting spread open for the very first time as the blonde took her anal virginity. I might have lost to Daphne in making you beep first, but I won't lose again, she said with a lewd grin on her face. With an amused shake of his head, Naruto latched onto her hips and pressed against her ass with more force, hissing out at how tight her ass was, barely able to penetrate her rear entrance. It only took a little longer for Naruto to finally push the tip of his beep into her ass. Damn, it's so insanely tight. Ha ha ha, there it is, Velma laughed out happily, her voice muffled from being stuffed full of his beep in her ass. The blonde smirked. Well then, I guess it's your turn to have some fun. Velma blushed heavily at the remark, but didn't say anything. Instead, she pushed herself back onto Naruto's shaft a couple times, letting him sink deeper, until finally he bottomed out inside of her. She let out a soft moan at the sensation. Fuck. So good, feels amazing, you're huge back there. Naruto smirked, gently rocking his hips forwards and backwards, allowing the woman to adjust to having his beep completely buried inside of her ass. This feels so fucking good, you're so big and thick, it's like heaven. MMHMMM. Velma moaned out, arching her back as Naruto began to pick up pace, sliding his beep in and out of her ass. Maybe we should move closer to the edge of the bed. Maybe that will make things easier, Velma suggested, looking over her shoulder at him. Naruto nodded, standing up off the bed, and then bending Velma back over the mattress with her ass raised high in the air. He grinned at her as he bent down, pushing his beep into her ass once more. The auburn-haired beauty let out a sharp gasp as he filled her. Oh shit. This is way better than I thought it would be. Naruto smirked, glad to hear you enjoy yourself. His thrusts became quicker, harder as he fucked her ass hard, enjoying the feel of her tightness around him. Her inner walls clenched tightly against his beep each time he plunged in deep. Velma wiggled her ass slightly, unable to keep still as Naruto pounded into her, faster. The blonde gave a quick chuckle and increased the speed of his thrusts, slamming his beep in and out of her ass with long, forceful strokes. Velma groaned loudly as she felt his thick member pounding into her tight asshole. Oh fuck. Keep doing that. Naruto grinned, grunting in response to her words and holding onto one of her thighs, using it as leverage to pull her leg up into the air. He held her leg there, while continuing to slam into her asshole, his beep fully impaling her tight hole. God. You're so big, Velma whimpered out as he began to pound in and out of her fast and hard, her asshole gripping his beep tightly. Her butt cheeks jiggled wildly with each of his powerful thrusts, as if they were trying to help her maintain balance or something. So fucking hot and tight, Naruto groaned out loud as he continued to thrust into her. His balls slapped against her ass loudly as he pushed deeper, his beep hitting the back of her rectum with every single thrust. Velma looked over her shoulder at him, biting her lip as she felt his beep slam in and out of her tight ass. You're gonna make me beep soon. Naruto chuckled. Alright then, just hold on tight. The blonde sped up even further, slamming his beep into her ass with each stroke, and within moments Velma screamed out in ecstasy, her orgasm overtaking her mind and body. Naruto grinned as her ass tightened around his beep, her muscles clenching tight and milking his shaft. Naruto continued to fuck her ass hard as her orgasm lasted for what seemed like minutes, before finally subsiding and leaving her panting and exhausted. Whoa, that was intense, Velma panted out. Naruto smirked as he pulled his spent beep out of her ass. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Now get ready for round 2. Ooh, yeah. Yep, I still have to beep. He smirked at her as he climbed onto the bed and on top of her. folding her legs up against her large beeps as he positioned the tip of his beep against her asshole again, wasting no time before burying his length inside her guts. Ah, fuck. I can feel you stretching my insides, it's so fucking good, Velma cried out lustfully. Naruto smirked, grabbing onto her thighs and holding himself firmly on top of her. Really? Do you want me to keep going? Velma nodded excitedly. Yeah. Keep fucking me, I need it. Naruto grinned, grinding his hips into hers, causing Velma to squeak as he slid his beep in and out of her ass. Please don't stop. I need your beep inside me, Velma begged, squirming beneath him. She reached up and grabbed onto his arms, pulling them closer to her chest and locking her legs around his waist. It looks like I'm not the only one who needs to beep again, Naruto grunted out, leaning down and kissing her neck playfully. Velma moaned softly as he kissed her, feeling his tongue licking along her neck. Naruto lifted his hips higher and slammed his beep deep inside her ass, making Velma yelp out in surprise. Fuck. Ooh, the busty woman gasped out as he rammed his beep back into her ass, over and over. Naruto smiled seductively. How does that feel? Velma bit her lip as she felt his beep hammering into her ass. Good. So good. Naruto chuckled and started to pick up the pace of his thrusts, pushing his length in and out of her ass with greater force. MMH, you're so hot and tight, God, I want to fuck you forever, he grunted out loud. Velma shivered beneath him, biting her lip as she felt his beep pounding into her. That feels so good, keep doing that. Hearing those words, Naruto was soon brought over the edge. Gritting his teeth tightly together, he gave her one last thrust before burying himself deep inside of her asshole. His entire shaft throbbing and his balls twitching as he unleashed his load deep inside her bowels, painting her insides white with his sticky seed. Ah, ah, Velma screamed out as her orgasm washed over her, causing her to jerk underneath him. Naruto collapsed atop of her, breathing heavily and grinning at her. I hope you two aren't done yet. We still got all evening. A voice called from the bathroom door. The two turned their heads to look at Daphne, who had a rather amused look on her face. Meanwhile, Naruto scratched the back of his head. If this was going to be a common occurrence with all three of them together, he should perhaps start going to the gym. Pleasing not one, but two women, might be a bit difficult if he didn't. Oh well, it was a sacrifice he was willing to commit for the greater good. Well, probably more his own self-interest than the greater good. Not that it mattered. He was going to have plenty of fun in the future regardless. Thanks.